Hi, good morning to everybody joining us today. I think it's good morning for most of you. My name is Rob Elder, and I am VP of Data Centers at Bulk. The webinar today, hosted by Bulk Data Centers, is titled What You Need to Know About the Changing Landscape of the European Power Sector. So just before we kick off, to let you know that the session will be recorded and a link should be made available after the webinar so you can access any of the material presented this morning. We also have a section, I should be on the right of your screen, whereby you can ask questions to any of the panelists, and they should try and address those during the session or at the Q&A at the end. So now I'm delighted to hand over to today's moderator, which is Dan Terpstra from the Sustainable Digital Infrastructure Alliance. He's Executive Chairman, who shall moderate the session today and introduce you to the rest of the panelists.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks for having me. Very delighted to be here today to talk to you about the many challenges facing digital infrastructure and the power sector at this moment in Europe. My name is Dan Terpstra. I am Executive Chairman of the SDIA, the Sustainable Digital Infrastructure Alliance, a NGO aiming to eradicate and reduce the climate impact of digital infrastructure through the use and the development of profitable business cases. Today, we will have a discussion on the power prices, the challenges and the changing landscape in Europe when it comes to its impact on the digital infrastructure. And I'm joined today in this discussion by Anders Lund Eriksson, by Atle Haga, and by Olivier Corradi. We will kick off this webinar with a presentation of all three gentlemen, which will be followed by a plenary discussion based on the presentations that they held and some of the statements that I prepared. However, it would be great if you have any questions and comments and post them, just like Rob mentioned before, in the dedicated section on this webpage. On your right hand side, we will select those and take them with us, and hopefully have them enlighten and enrich the discussion and the conversation. So just as a brief introduction from my end of things, today we're talking about the power supply crisis, which in recent months and in the last year has increased and has shown quite a difference in terms of setting compared to the many years before. First and foremost, coming out of the global pandemic, the entire economy, including the power sector, was of course confronted with the global supply chain crunch, the global supply chain crisis. That was only further fueled and complicated by geopolitics in Europe, which is, in that sense, a euphemistic way of describing the ongoing war in Ukraine and the pressure that it's putting on the supply of gas towards Europe, the ban on coal, the potential ban on oil, and the impact of those developments on the prices of commodity and ultimately on the price of electricity, the fuel for the digital infrastructure. And of course, underlying that all is the continuous move towards a more climate neutral and climate friendly energy sector and the demands and fluctuation mismatches that occur as a result of that and the translation into prices. Today, the first presentation, as you can see here on your screen, will be kicked off by Anders. Anders is working at the Thema Consulting Group, a Norwegian-based consulting group looking into and focusing on the electricity sector, where Anders has been is a partner. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Anders, who will take us through his slides.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks for inviting me. So I will say a few words about the current situation in the power markets and basically how we ended up here. Let's start with why we're probably all here. Power prices across Europe has never been higher. And the main reason is basically a surge in the cost for thermal power generation, and in particular for gas generation. And this has resulted in a steep increase in the power prices in the last months, and not only in countries like Germany and the UK, where there is a large share of gas-fired generation, but also in the Nordic market, as the Nordics is connected to continental and British markets. So how did we end up here? The by far most important reason is the surge in gas prices. So first, last winter was colder than normal and with lower than normal gas supply in the North Sea, which resulted in low gas storage levels. The most important reason is probably the Russian-Ukraine conflict, though. Russia is providing more than 40% of the EU's natural gas imports. And interestingly, and we saw already in early 2021 that Russian Gazprom emptied the European gas storages and did not supply more than what they were committed to, as they normally do. So hence, already a year ago, Russia started using its dominant position in the European gas market to drive up gas prices for whatever reason. So as we moved towards 2022, the situation got more tense, and it became obvious to the markets that you wouldn't see any flows on the new pipeline from Russia to Germany, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So prices kept increasing. And despite the current sanctions, there are still quite significant gas flows from Russia into Europe, but gas prices are obviously extremely high, and they are very sensitive to signals from Russia, and also a fear on curtailed flows from Russia into Europe. So also the CO2 prices are record high, and this is primarily due to increased climate targets in Europe. So the CO2 price is determined in the CO2 market, and coal and gas-fired power plant operators must buy allowances to cover their emissions. So the CO2 price is also an important driver for power prices, and therefore this increase in CO2 price has also contributed to higher power prices. And then next, we have also seen lower renewable generation than expected over the last years. In the Nordics, we have had a dry year with little hydro generation, and in addition, there has been little wind power generation throughout Europe. Additionally, we have had cold temperatures, so higher electricity demand, and actually these things tend to occur simultaneously, so that has also contributed to higher power prices. And finally, we see decommissioning of firm capacity across Europe. So this year, all nuclear reactors in Germany will be shut down. And also in Sweden, there have been decommissioning of nuclear reactors, and across Europe, coal-fired capacity is being closed, basically as a measure to reach climate targets. So what can we say about the future? Well, first of all, it is highly uncertain. We see that gas has become the main short-term price driver for power across Europe. So the implication is basically that power prices are largely driven by developments in the gas market, and hence the developments in Ukraine and the signals from Russia, as I said. So obviously, Europe is trying to replace those gas flows from Russia, but this is not done overnight. So at least for a while, we need to live with this uncertainty and the impact of Russian gas. Second, weather is already actually a significant price driver for power, and this is just going to increase going forward as the renewable share in Europe is increasing. So with more intermittent wind and solar generation, the variations due to weather is going to increase. And then finally, I wanted also to mention that this policy aspect, which is very uncertain at the moment. So previously, we're used to these processes that took years to change climate and energy policies, whereas in the current situation, these policies are changed more or less overnight. So we saw that, for instance, when Belgium decided to extend the lifetime of nuclear reactors, we see a lot of new renewable targets coming, and so on. Spain is introducing a cap on gas prices. In addition to that, there is a debate about the power market design in Europe, and even though it's highly uncertain what comes out of that, if you're going to change that, there is going to be potentially a very significant impact on power prices. So this is our current outlook for power prices in these three markets. First of all, I want to highlight that the outlook is very, very uncertain. But what we're seeing is that we expect that the price levels also in the years to come are going to be higher than what we're used to. I want to also highlight that this is the commodity price part. So as an end user, you will also pay like grid tariffs and taxes, and so this is only a part of the total electricity bill. And currently, obviously, this is a rather big part of the bill. With lower price levels, I mean, the differences in taxes, national taxes, will play an important role as well, and also obviously grid tariffs, which is different for different countries, and not least different regions, different locations within the country. So basically, what we are seeing here is, towards 2030, kind of a normalization in the power market, and in that sense, the commodity price part is fairly similar across Europe, but then there might be quite significant differences in terms of taxes and grid tariffs and so on, which are not seen in this picture. So I also want to mention briefly kind of the security of supply aspect, which is probably also going to be more important going forward. So to illustrate this, we looked at new renewable targets from the German government. And basically what we're seeing is that if those targets for 2030 are met, you're going to need a whole lot of new firm capacity in the country. So basically in the order of like 15, 20 gigawatts of new firm capacity. And effectively, going back a couple of months, you would probably expect this to come from gas-fired plants, but obviously increasing the gas-fired capacity would also drive up the gas demand in the country. So I guess it's at this stage quite uncertain how to address the security of supply issue going forward, and that just leaves us with even greater uncertainty about the power markets in the future. So I think I'm going to stop here as for my brief introduction to what is currently happening in the power market. So thank you all for listening.
Anders, thank you very much. Much appreciated to give that first overview. Very interesting to see the intertwine of traditional factors that affect the price, as well as security of supply affected by geopolitics. Really looking forward to have a elaborate discussion on that after the other two presentations. Just before we move on, one quick question to you, if I may. So, you've talked about a couple of trends when it comes to perhaps potential installed capacity, trends when it comes to future power price development, both in the Nordics as well as in the UK and Germany. So what are the most, in your view, interesting trends that you see in the power market that can have a direct impact on the digital infrastructure? Is there any that you think is worth highlighting?
Yeah, I think there are a few trends we're seeing at the moment, and I mean the main takeaway from what I just said was probably that kind of risk is on, the uncertainty has never been greater. So those who could maybe live with the volatility in power prices that we've seen historically may actually need to look into, how to deal with this risk and maybe different risk options. And when we look, for instance, to the Nordics, we've seen that the price, the area price differences have been extremely high, and there is probably a discussion whether kind of the current hedging instruments are adequate in addressing those price differences. So I think that's maybe one of the things to have on your radar going forward. And I mean, obviously also other aspects like security of supply, as I mentioned, but also the value of flexibility, for instance, that, if you have an option to actually shift some of your load from 1 hour to another, that is probably going to be more valuable going forward. Maybe we'll hear more about that later today.
Interesting. Thanks, and thanks for your presentation and your reflection. Moving on to the next presentation, you already see the starting slide of Atle on your screen. Atle is working for Host Norway and Vice President at Statkraft. For this particular department, has a long history in Statkraft and the energy sector in general. And Atle will talk us through, after the more, let's say, European focus of Anders, a more, let's say, regional focus, and on, amongst others, a deeper integration with digital infrastructure and potentially even heat reuse. So Atle, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you a lot. And I will basically continue on Anders' presentation and just leave this for my introduction, this one slide. And it shows the future price for next year, the calendar year 2022, for different energy contracts throughout Europe. The lowest one is the gas price, the TTF. As you can see, since last year, it has increased from around 15-20 euros now to up towards 80 euros per megawatt hour. Along that, the black line is then the southern Norway area price for the same period, the calendar year 2023, which has followed quite suit, so to speak. On top, you can see the energy pricing in Germany and France. And as you can see, they follow the same pattern, but has increased much more significantly, which Anders explained quite good. This graph has a lot of information, and you could talk a lot around it. And one of the key aspects here is that looking at this graph alone, the difference between the power price and the gas price has increased. So one should believe that the gas price or the gas-fired power plants should increase their production. However, due to the record high CO2 or the emissions cost, this has not happened. So in fact, there is more coal-fired power plants running now in comparison to 1 year ago, compared to the gas-fired power plants, which is not good for the environment. Furthermore, one can see that there's an obvious increased difference between the Nordics and the continent. And of course, all of this implies a much higher part of digital infrastructure's OPEX is now related to electricity. And one could foresee that this should give more focus on more efficient solutions, lower PUEs at the data centers, and try to figure out new ways of being more efficient in the data center, for instance. And also we foresee a more focus on using rest heat as an asset, because now the rest heat has, of course, the same energy as before, but the value of this has increased since the energy prices has increased as well. We also think that this shows that data centers with operations in different locations could use this as an opportunity. If there's a possibility to shift load from higher prices to lower priced areas, that could be beneficial for both the customers and the data centers themselves. And of course, it's easier to transport bits and bytes than electrons. So that's good for the total European energy system as well. And also we foresee a more clear hot and cold data thinking. Using an example, if there's a stock exchange trade done in London, of course, the broker needs a data center in the proximity of the city of London to do that and do the transaction. But when the transaction is done and you need to store those data out of accounting and maybe do some artificial intelligence on top of that and compute how to on a higher level, it's much more sufficient and less costly to have that data stored in a data center not within Ring 1 in London, which has the highest power prices and the land prices in Europe. So to round this up, it shows that the electricity part will have given a higher OPEX on digital infrastructure. It will give more focus on electricity pricing, both from the industry itself, but also from the customers, which could be an opportunity as well within digital infrastructure.
Thank you, Atle. Very interesting, and I think it'll be a really good point also to come back in the plenary discussion about some of the points that you raised with regards to load shifting and connectivity, whereby indeed we do not move the electrons across Europe, but we move the data and the compute across Europe based on the underlying infrastructure of fiber and others. Very, very interesting point. Now, one of the topics that you mentioned in your presentation was the waste heat, or actually the residual heat coming out of data centers, which is still the same actually as before this high increase in prices, the same in terms of energy content in joules and megajoules. However, the price has changed, or at least the market price has changed, as you mentioned. So in your view, what is the main challenge that you've identified when looking at waste heat integration of digital infrastructure?
Yeah, I guess the main issues has up to now at least been location and of course cost. The lowest hanging fruit of using the rest heat is district heating, which we have a lot of in Nordics. The problem is that at least the larger data centers, they are not located in urban areas. So it's not very easy to connect those large facilities to a district heating, since there is a too high cost of constructing pipes, etc. However, we see several not minor but co-location data centers and also minor data centers that are connected in all the larger cities in the Nordic countries. But it's still a cost issue as well, because the rest heat from data centers doesn't have the temperature that is needed into this system. So you need a heat pump to boost the temperature, which also is a cost, of course. And also there's this lack of flexibility. I mean, district heating systems or greenhouses or fish farming would love to have rest heat from data centers. However, the data centers would not be obliged to, at any given time, give the energy to the user, which means that the users need to have some backup, some electrical boilers or something like that, which sort of destroys the economics in the business case. But That being said, we see that the edge data centers, it's much easier to connect to the larger district heating systems, and also that the greenhouses could be a off-taker of rest heat. And also, especially in Norway, we have a lot of fish farming. And I'm sure you all have heard of this lobster farming, which is now growing, which is a perfect use of rest heat, in my opinion. So rounding up to answer your question, it's the investment cost and lack of flexibility which are the highest hurdles as of date.
Yeah, thanks, Atle, for that elaborate answer. And indeed, what we see as well is that, especially when it comes to the flexibility, there's some very interesting developments ongoing, especially also on a European Union level, because of course the original heat districts were based on reliability for the end users, which, as heat is a residual product out of the data center, is not the primary focus of the data center, and meeting those two worlds is more often than not challenging. But perhaps the new energy efficiency directive coming out of Brussels can provide some tools there. Next up, we are joined by Olivier. Olivier is active since almost 6 years at Electricity Map, founder of Electricity Map, a tool, a solution to highlight and to map the carbon intensity of grids starting in Europe, now North America, and perhaps even a further global presence. But Olivier, I'll let you get into that. Thanks for joining, and really looking forward to having your view on this particular dilemma.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for having me here, and thank you for the presentation. I am the founder of Electricity Map, where we are at the core organizing the world's electricity information in order to drive the transition towards a truly decarbonized electricity system. And what we focus on really is the consumer's perspective. And so that is the perspective I will take in this presentation. So the topic I'd like to cover here represents the incentives to decarbonize the power grid. And there's really two pieces to that. The first one is on the generator side, and the second one is on the consumer side. So from a systems perspective, the majority of the greenhouse gas emitted, they are coming from the generators burning the fossil fuels directly. And in carbon accounting lingo, we call that scope 1. So scope 1 is the result of you directly emitting carbon as the result of a burning process. So gas turbines would burn fossil fuels, gas to emit carbon and generate electricity. Coal power plants the same. And these power plants, at least in Europe, are exposed to a carbon tax. That's the ETS, the emission trading system that we have, which is a cap and trade system, but it's covered by law, which means that every time a gas turbine or coal power plant is burning some fossil fuel, on the price of electricity that will be able to supply to the market, there will be a piece that comes from this carbon tax, and that creates a direct incentive to dispatch the lowest carbon technology, and there's an arbitrage between being the cheapest technology and the least emitting one. And this carbon price has increased quite a lot. So I actually forgot to put the year on these figures, but the 30 euro per ton of CO2 was actually last year in January. And now, as we saw from the presentation from Anders, who had a beautiful graph that could also find its way to this presentation, we are now at 80 euros per ton of CO2, which actually means that there are some significant incentives to decarbonize on the generators side. However, the place that we are representing and working a lot with is the consumer side, because consumers, they cause emissions indirectly by consuming from the generators. And that is what we call scope 2. So it's the result of consumers consuming electricity that has been generated in a process that emits greenhouse gases. These companies are voluntarily, so they're not obligated to, but they're voluntarily setting targets to decarbonize electricity supply. In a nutshell, they all wanted to go to a COP and be able to say that they've put some net zero objectives. And these are set through carbon accounting standards, such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and Science-Based Targets Initiative, which represents the objectives that they're putting in the future. So the key points to remember here is that it's a voluntary target. And the second piece is that it's science-based targets that are representing the ambitions that they have and how they're planning in the future. Now, a key piece that increases the complexity here is that the way you're measuring your carbon footprint as a company, well, there's different ways to do it, and therefore there's different ways to reach these targets. And the reason comes from the fact that when we take all the emissions from the generators in the system, there are multiple ways to take these emissions and allocate them to the consumers. So the first methodology that exists, which I think is one of the most intuitive ones, is the location-based. So the location-based basically says that as a consumer, I cannot choose the origin of my electricity as it irreversibly mixes as it gets injected into the grid. Another way to say that is that we can't selectively decide to send wind electricity through a specific power line to a specific consumer. And so it has a couple of consequences to think that way. It means that the thing you can do as a consumer to lower your footprint is to consume electricity at times where the grid is greener. For example, at times the wind is blowing, the sun is shining. So it incentivizes flexibility of the consumer who wants to reduce its location-based footprint. It incentivizes optimal sitting. So a data center, it's probably more interesting to position it in a place where the electricity is greener than a place where it's not, because the flexibility will only take you so far. A couple of hurdles or problems that arise with this incentive mechanism is that there's no way to fund capacity investments or storage investments. When I talk about capacity investment, I'm specifically talking about funding, for example, the deployment of more wind or solar. There's just no instrument that allows you to do this because there's no certificate that you can buy that is eligible in this methodology, because again, you can't choose the origin of your electricity. However, the last point is that it's a credible traceability instrument in the sense that if you go to people in the street and you ask them, where does your electricity come from? And does it differ from the one that your neighbor is getting? Probably they will intuitively say that both electricity, mine and the one that goes to my neighbor, are the same. So in that sense, there's a credibility piece to the traceability of it. Now, really I think the biggest problem we have with this incentive is that it doesn't really allow a corporate consumer to fund the energy transition by expressing their preference. And this is why we have this second column here, which is called the market-based on a yearly level, which means that you can take your total consumption as a consumer on a yearly level, and then you can buy guarantees of origin or renewable energy certificates in the US in order to cover that consumption with renewable electricity. And the advantage here is that it is a way to fund new projects with the caveat that the certificate needs to be what we call additional. So I'm not going to go into the details here, but it basically means that the action of you buying a certificate needs to be enough, meaningful enough that it will actually incentivize the project to be built. And often that's related to the price of the certificate. It needs to create a revenue stream that is significant enough to drive a proper price signal to the project builder. The issue with this scheme is that it doesn't incentivize flexibility, because why would you even think about shifting the location or the time at which you're consuming electricity if in the end you can just cover it with certificates at the end of the year? And that is the main key. The other piece is that the only projects that are eligible in terms of funding are more renewables. And instead, maybe what we need is more storage systems or more interconnectors in some of the places that are challenged. And the last challenge we have here is that it is not a credible traceability instrument, i.e. a consumer won't really intuitively understand that their electricity during the night can be coming from solar electricity because you simply bought a certificate. So you have this new paradigm coming up, which is called 24/7, which is the same as it basically tries to take the best of both worlds. And it is a way to procure electricity through granular guarantees of origin at an hourly level that also require the electricity to be physically deliverable. So this physical deliverability means that the consumption needs to happen at the same time as the generation, and it also needs to be physically deliverable, which means that the grid should be uncongested between the point of production and the point of consumption. And you see suddenly that there's a lot of things that are incentivized. Flexibility is incentivized because you are better off at using electricity at a time where the grid is cleaner, because then you won't have to buy certificates on top of that. Optimal sitting of projects as well, because the location at which you consume electricity matters. It will fund the capacity projects, but it will also fund storage and other grid projects, because there is an incentive to buy certificates, or there's an incentive to build storage systems if you can buy certificates at a time where the grid is clean and then resell them at a time where the grid is dirty. So storage is also incentivized here, and it is a more credible traceability instrument. It becomes closer to the location-based. So the reason why this becomes interesting is that there suddenly is an alignment of incentives between the corporate sustainability targets and the electricity prices. So this graph is a bit small on the top right-hand side, but on the horizontal axis, you see the penetration of wind and solar on a percentage of annual consumption. And on the y-axis, the vertical axis, you see the correlation between price and CO2. And you see a general trend that the more there's wind and sun on the system, the alignment between price and CO2 becomes much better. And this means that suddenly there's a way for companies to be able to reach their targets and reduce their footprint at the same time. So electricity procurement also now funds more relevant projects. It's not only more wind and solar, it's also storage, flexibility projects. It's more technology inclusive. The last piece of it is also that suddenly flexibility is incentivized by the footprint reduction of different products. So if you think about what Tesla is doing, Tesla has a footprint in scope 3 related to the electricity that their consumers are using. And that suddenly creates an incentive for Tesla to create a product where smart charging is included. It will reduce the consumer's footprint, but it will also reduce Tesla's footprint. And the final piece is that it incentivizes government to green their grid, because you'd like to optimally put your data center in a place where the grid will be cleaner in the future. So two quick examples that I find exciting about where the future is going from a digital infrastructure perspective. Microsoft made a commitment called 100-100-0 that is the equivalent of 24/7. And they are now thinking in Windows updates, they're starting as a beta test to make sure that the updates are scheduled at the times where the grid is the greenest, which is interesting because you start seeing flexibility built into digital products, Windows in this case. The other example is Google Cloud, the cloud provider, is now allowing you to place your computations in the data centers where the emissions are the lowest. And as a second step, they're also starting to do load shifting, not only in time, but also in space. So imagine that the wind is suddenly blowing in Ireland instead of Denmark, then you can switch automatically your computations to be in Ireland, which I found to be quite exciting use case to mention. So as a conclusion, I would point to the fact that these new interesting carbon incentives on the consumer side are starting to create an alignment that is much clearer between the power prices and the carbon footprint and the sustainability targets, which in the end should help us unify all of the forces that need in order to accelerate the transition to a lower carbon grid.
Thank you, Olivier, for your presentation and the very interesting points that you mentioned. I mean, as the build out of renewable sources continues both in Europe as well as globally, you see a move towards more and more intermittent resources, and where traditionally, right, the flexibility was very much on a producer side, turning the coal or gas-fired power plant or the nuclear reactor slightly up or down to meet demand. Now it becomes, to a certain degree, so unpredictable going forward that more flexibility also from a consumer, not only producer side, is needed and wanted. So that's very interesting to hear. Thanks for that. Now, the map that you're building, the service is focusing on, different geographical areas, countries, net zones, in case of the Nordics, and highlighting its differences. So when looking at those geographical differences, are there any differences that you can highlight when it comes to the ability, let's say, of, for instance, what we're talking about here, the digital infrastructure, to anticipate the fluctuations of carbon intensity in the grid?
Yes, absolutely. And a good way to think about this is that we're highlighting a lot the demands and the needs for flexibility, but not all of the places have the same types of flexibility requirements. And if we take, for example, in Europe, the differences between a country like Ireland and Denmark with a very high renewable, varying renewable penetration, such as wind, you have completely different uncertainties than from a system that looks like the Swedish, the Norwegian, or the French system, which have a much stronger low carbon base load based on the nuclear factors. And that is, these topological differences will have great impact in the way that sustainability targets will unfold and how they will utilize the flexibility in the different systems. And I believe that the spatial flexibility, the ability to move load across borders, so to speak, will become something that can actually have a much bigger impact than simply looking at the time flexibility itself. But I think in general, we're moving towards a world where there's more focus on carbon instead of just looking at percentage of wind and solar, which I think is an interesting focus.
Thanks for that. This would be a good moment to ask both Anders and Atle back on stage. Thanks again for your presentation. Olivier, thanks for the presentation of all three of you. That was very interesting. And the last point, Olivier, that you mentioned really comes close and as an overlap with one of the points that Atle actually mentioned when it comes to load shifting, right? Shifting bits and bytes around, zeros and ones, rather than electrons. Now, from your perspective, Atle, what do you see as the main challenges surrounding that solution?
Well, I assume that the main challenge is the customer or the hyperscalers' perception or actual need for low latency. Because the cloud regions are in the cloud regions they are because that's the proximity to the customers. And of course, the longer away you go, as a rule of thumb, you can get lower prices. That applies for at least in Europe as a whole and in the Nordics as well. There are large price differentials between southern part of Norway and Sweden and the northern part of those countries. But the latency is higher, and that is of course a major hurdle, I think.
Yeah. And then linked to that, if we look forward and look into the future, as Anders highlighted, there could be a more convergence of power prices in Europe. That could have an effect on that kind of load shifting as well, right, Anders?
Yeah, potentially. Because what you would probably expect in the longer term would be a convergence in at least price levels, but you're probably still going to see large variations in kind of a shorter time frame. So, there is a lot of wind in the north while there is little wind in the south, for instance, still. So kind of this graph these effects more or less average out. So it doesn't mean that the incentive go away, I would say.
Thanks. This for me would be a good moment also to have a quick check in the chat. And one of the interesting questions that came up, which I think all three of you could weigh in on, is a question by Roy. And Roy is asking about the tipping point where it could be more, commercially interesting to run your own gensets rather than consuming from the grid, i.e. using your flexibility not so much on your own demand side, but producing your own supply to deal with and optimize against power price market fluctuation. Now, as I see all three of you nodding, so that's already interesting. Thanks. I just want to kick the round off by Anders to ask, from your consultancy background, is that something that you see? Is that something that you've How do you look at that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're probably going to assess this on a case-by-case basis, but I would assume that the generator would be running on like either diesel or gas or something like that. So we see that all these fuels are very expensive at the moment. So, you know, power is expensive, but so is running your own generator. So therefore, I wouldn't assume that it makes that much sense at the moment. But maybe if we run into a situation where, you know, all Russian gas is curtailed and the power prices go extreme, that might be more relevant, I guess.
Adler?
And
Yeah,
if,
sure.
if just to follow up, I agree with Anders. I mean, the cost you get from power from your own gensets, of course, reflects of the price of gas or diesel or whatever you're using in the genset. So the marginal cost will not be significantly lower than from the power grid. It is only in places where the power grid or the grid costs is increasing significantly. This could be a solution, and maybe in connection with the development of the hydrogen and ammonia markets in Europe in the years to come. But it's still very early, and I don't see this as a tipping point anywhere now, and I certainly do not hope so from an environmental perspective.
Olivier, anything to weigh in on?
I don't have as many insights as the two gentlemen had before, but maybe one interesting perspective to add is that there are now some off-grid solutions that are starting to be prototyped by different new data centers, and I'm thinking actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think Google started something with Fluence, I think, where they're having some interesting storage systems in order to be able to run off-grid for a certain period of time in Belgium. I do not know if anyone has any insights, but this is also an interesting direction that is, I would say, getting incentivized, but these how power prices as well, right?
Yeah, no, it is, and there are different initiatives ongoing, both in terms of fuel cells as well as battery energy storage backup, and the trade-off in many of these cases, with my history also back in the energy sector, is that the moment to use these fuel cells, the moment to use these battery energy storage are most interesting when prices are at a, let's say, commercially very interesting level to either feed back to the grid and gain direct revenues, or to supplement whatever you offtake off the grid by reducing your energy cost by consumption. However, more often than not, those prices occur at a moment where the grid is, let's say, not very stable, because those are the moments where there is quite a big mismatch in supply and demand. And actually, those are the moments where you would want your backup to be completely filled to the brim, so that if it goes right, you can supply your services still to the end users, and, you know, if anything, just live up to the, let's say, contractual agreements that you've agreed with them in your service level agreements. So there's an incentive which moves in a kind of opposite direction, which is very interesting to see. And what I've discovered, at least historically, is that the peaks in the power market were too little and too few to really justify building a designated setup only for avoiding those peaks. Olivier, and as well as Anders, you both highlighted in your presentation the rise in the CO2 prices, the carbon prices under the European Union Emission Trading Scheme. And it's core to one of your solutions, Olivier, and you also highlighted that rather than talking about percentage penetration of renewable energy, you see, you know, much more talk about CO2 grams of the energy mix and the prices. Now, before we go into, let's say, a more specific, perhaps, market outlook by Anders, but how do you see that change in perception in the market, and how do you see those prices moving forward?
So I think I'll speak to how these value is being perceived in the market, because what we see from our perspective in working a lot with product managers that are building new digital products that incorporate this CO2 information is that the perceived value is actually much higher than the actual value, like monetary value attached to it. There's two angles I will take here. The first one is if you are an electric vehicle customer or user, owner, I would say, one of the most important things to you is to make sure that you're having an impact on the environment because you're probably paid a price premium when you actually paid the electric vehicle. And so from the smart charging perspective, there's a higher value in being able to save CO2 than to actually save a little bit of money from the flexibility that you highlight there. So the perceived value for this particular segment is higher. Another example that I would like to take, but which is more on the corporate side, is that companies who are consuming a lot of digital services are now setting more aggressive targets, and the developers inside these digital companies, I'm thinking, for example, take a Spotify, most of their footprint will be from the cloud that they're using, and the developers inside these companies will really want to use the cloud system that uses the less CO2, and they're starting to build systems to shift things around and so on and so forth. And that currently they don't receive any monetary reward for doing so. And so the perceived value, the branding value of it, being able to attract employees, retain them, and showcase that your product is future-proof is also something that has a lot of value that is currently intangible. You can't put a monetary value to it, but it is something that is of high impact.
Thanks. Anders, curious also for your point of view on this particular topic.
Yeah, I mean, at least from a market perspective, we would at least expect that the CO2 price will stay fairly high over the next few years. And as what we're seeing in the market is that it's going to be quite short, actually. As a lot of allowances are taken out of the market. And so in a way, at least we wouldn't expect the CO2 price to fall back to those old levels, which were very, very low. So the CO2 market or a high CO2 price has come to stay in a way. So the only sort of downside would probably be that if we see a more kind of normalization in the gas markets, that could have a certain impact, like a negative impact on the CO2 price. But still, due to the very ambitious climate policies, we're expecting to see high prices also going forward.
All right. And is there anything, let's say, more geographically specific, for instance, to the Nordics or to Norway, Atle, out of your role that you think is relevant to highlight and to mention here?
No, I mean, to follow up on Anders, I think that with a very ambitious climate goals in Europe, that will affect the CO2 price, which is a European system. Where we in the Nordics could maybe be a part of, if not the solution, or at least to help that transition is to use some of our renewables to generate hydrogen and ammonia, which could help especially the industry in the continent to greenify their steel and other products.
Yeah,
and to make that those markets to fly, I think it's crucial to have quite a high CO2 price. So that's sort of part of the solution as well.
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on there, and I think that at the moment the CO2 price is at a level that really starts to reflect a price level that is including more and more externalities, and it's really pushing us towards a more sustainable, carbon neutral, fossil free future. And there are some really interesting initiatives also when it comes to decarbonizing the rest of the industry, starting with steel and other initiatives. Of course, as we are in a somewhat near perfect storm with those high carbon prices, very, very disturbed geopolitics, as well as a global supply chain crunch, you do see price levels that were, up until, let's say, at least 2 years, 1.5 years ago, unheard of, with a degree of volatility which was never seen. Luckily, in a well-functioning economy and with innovation, we can see end users and consumers adapting to it and starting to ask more and more questions. Also, for instance, as Olivier highlighted, okay, what's then the climate impact of the cloud services that I use, even though it is, you know, not on-prem and perhaps less visible to me in a digital infrastructure because I am coding the text and coding the lines, but through the virtualization layer, it's very much detached from the premises where I am working. Gentlemen, looking at the time, I think it's fair enough to say that we'll slowly but surely wrap up, as people are most likely in this day and age back-to-back booked with new and other video meetings. I want to thank all three of you for your very informed presentations and contributions to the discussions, from a general market outlook, more focusing in more on Norway specific and the reuse and the challenges surrounding the reuse of heat, towards the mapping and creating visibility and awareness of carbon intensities of the grid. It's been a really interesting hour, 56 minutes on the mark as we now. And I want to thank you all for joining me in this discussion. And that just leaves me 1 or 2 minutes to hand back to you, Rob. And thank you for having us.
Super. Thanks, Dan, and thanks to all the panelists today. I mean, we've been asked quite a bit about customers, or from various customers and people, about what's happening in the market with regards to power. And you know, it's evident there is some significant short-term operational pain, as well as some short-term cost pain, which is, you know, in some cases we've seen, you know, organizations going into administration due to their, you know, procurement of power decisions in the past. So I think this is a very timely panel. I thought there were some really interesting discussions. We'll make the presentations available. I know we haven't touched on a number of things, such as, you know, different government intervention on expansion and seeing what impact that might have on sort of certain long-term challenges for building out capacity in certain markets, and in particular in a sustainable way. But certainly interesting to see how, and Olivier touched on this, the speed and adoption of some of these new digital solutions that embed this carbon data in their products, and perhaps how consumers view this monetary cost versus more kind of carbon impact cost in their buying and operational behavior in the future may start to speed some of these initiatives up as well. So yeah, very interesting panel. Thanks ever so much to you all. Thank you also to those that have joined the session today. And I think we'll give you 1 minute of your time back before your next meeting. So thanks very much to all.
Thank you.